You're listening to Fellow Travellers with East of Moon. Welcome to Fellow Travellers, a podcast from East of Moon. We are an organisation that studies, experiments with and develops the ways in which communities create together. My name is Josie Ann Gatens, and this episode I was joined by Brendan Arnold, the UK government's first ever creative technologist. Brendan works for Policy Lab, a cross-disciplinary innovation team which is part of the civil service and established to enhance policymaking through design, innovation and people-centred approaches. He kindly took time out of his trip to Iceland to discuss the intersection between creativity and policy. So Brendan Arnold, welcome to Fellow Travellers. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You are a creative technologist with Policy Lab.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite an interesting title. First of all, maybe you tell me a little bit about your background before you joined Policy Lab and how you got a job like that.
Yeah, so it's quite a sort of a winding path actually, but I started out doing physics, so I kind of studied physics for 12 years. And at some point I kind of figured out that academia wasn't for me. It's brilliant in some ways, but terrible in others. I think really what I missed from that was like a lot of teamwork element and sort of working with groups kind of thing. Academia kind of has that, but it's also this kind of strange frenemy dynamic that goes on kind of thing. Lots of jostling for first authorship and things like that. So I kind of went on to then work in tech because once I sort of finished that, I decided I was going to write an app and become rich. And so I spent a year writing an app, put it on the store. I made about £50. So I kind of figured out, well, I probably need a proper job now. Off the back of that, I got a job sort of writing apps and websites and things like that in agencies. But then I also did sort of like side stuff, sort of making artworks with my brother. So we collaborated. My brother's a fine artist and a maker. So I worked with him on sort of artworks. We put together exhibitions. We kind of show them around Bristol and then in London as well. But then also as well, I kind of contracted with his company that makes sets and props to make animatronics and sort of stuff for museums and things like that. Well, just a couple of sort of like commissions kind of thing, but enough that it made me into a creative technologist rather than just a programmer kind of thing, you know. So that happened for a long time. Eventually, I kind of got enough. I was kind of stable and settled enough. You know, I'd kind of got a mortgage and a house and all that kind of thing. I was like, what do I do next? Tech is actually quite boring. It's sort of like, I really think there's this thing in tech where you're kind of in a gilded cage. You know, a lot of tech is set up to sort of manage away the programmer's problems. And so you're kind of treated really, really well and paid quite well as well. But at the same time, you're kind of not given visibility on anything. And it's strangely infantilizing, actually, the kind of world of a tech programmer. And I think that kind of shows through in how Google presents itself with Haribo and ball pools and things like that kind of thing. So, and that's really revered in tech kind of thing. So I kind of wanted to do something a bit more meaningful, and it's kind of thinking back to, you know, academia, where you're kind of like, you're doing this sort of really important work kind of thing, you know, which I did kind of miss a bit. And so this job came up, and yeah, it was really, really interesting. It's in government, so it's not quite as well reimbursed as like tech is, but it was super interesting and had all this interesting stuff, and it kind of brought together a lot of the elements that I was interested in, and we had that kind of public service side of things which kind of made it feel worthwhile. It combined policy making and tech stuff and tech know-how, and also as well it gave me a bit of space to actually take the role as well. So yeah, that's how I came to be creative technologist.
The government's first.
The government's first. Yeah, as far as we know. I mean, we're talking about central government as well. There may well be someone in a local council somewhere who's a creative technologist, but we don't know of them yet. I know there's someone in the BBC who was. So,
okay,
but that's kind of like an arm's length body, so I'm not sure if that counts.
I don't think that counts. I don't think that counts at all. And then, so Policy Lab, it is part of the UK government, but it has this slightly, I think when people think about how government functions, an organisation like Policy Lab and the way that it relates to the government might not be their initial thinking of like how government operates. So can you just explain perhaps for listeners how you work with the government as part of the government, so to speak?
So Policy Lab is quite unusual for a government team. So to be clear, we are sort of civil servants. We're not sort of outside contractors brought in or anything like that. But we operate under that model. So essentially, we're inside of government. We're a civil servant team, and we're what they call cost recovery. So basically, our budget isn't allocated at the start of the year. Instead, we have to go out and sort of find business amongst governments. So some of our work, we have to sort of swap hats and sort of become salespeople, and find policymakers in any department, local or central, who kind of have knotty problems that need to be solved. So Policy Lab goes out and finds those kind of people and helps them with their whatever it is they're working on, that they might need a slightly different approach, or perhaps they're looking to do things a little bit differently, basically.
By a little bit differently, I mean, essentially what the kind of work that Policy Lab is doing boils down to is approaching policy making in creative or I don't want to say unusual, but, like you say, looking at doing things a little bit differently from potentially traditional models of policy making, and working with different groups, whether it's a local council or a body like, I know that you've done work with, what's it called? Natural England. Yeah. How does this work in practice? How does the work of Policy Lab, of being a creative technologist, what's your practical output of that? If someone met you and shook your hand at a conference and was like, that's super interesting, but what do you do?
It's really difficult to explain.
Yeah.
So Policy Lab I'm talking about the Creative Technologist bit here because I'm still sort of forming that. Part of my actual thing is trying to find out what a creative technologist does in government and forming that job role, essentially. It's like building that out and figuring out what potential value can be brought to government around that. But what I do kind of does align quite a lot with what Policy Lab does. Yeah, going back to doing things a little bit differently. So I don't want to overstate that, people only come to us because they want to do something different for the sake of being different. Very occasionally, we do get a commission for that because there are incentives to innovate and things like that and to try things out. But most of the time, it's because they have a knotty problem or something that's quite tricky. So more traditional policy making might take quite a planned and structured. I mean, we have a plan and a structure, but like they take an approach which is doing lots of upfront work, lots of planning, and then figuring out how to sort of propagate that or disseminate that, both within government and to the public as well. Now, that's kind of a crude picture. I mean, the design-led approach, which we kind of like are real champions of, is becoming much more of a standard. It's part of the policy standards. And this is much more test and learn, iterate, try something out on a small scale, and then see if it works, and then evaluate, and then try again. So that's sort of like the design approach. We also follow a lot of the Design Council's Double Diamond, which is really digging into what the problem is in the first instance and going big with the potential problem space. So you might have a broad question, which could be something like, I'm going to try and think of a thing right now, but how in the sort of Natural England case, how do we engage early stage creatives in doing nature positive work? But then as you investigate more, you might actually dig out more fine-grained problems that are easier to tackle, or perhaps it might be more like, how do we get early stage creatives enthusiastic? Or how do we give them the resources they need to do the work that they want to do, for example? So you could end up with more fine-grained problems like that. Mm-hmm. Once you've got the problems, a set of problems, you kind of refine them down, and then you might go to the solutions, which again, you kind of go big with potential solutions. Lots of idea generation and things like that before focusing in on some of the ones you want to follow up on. And so we kind of do that. And then on top of that, we have our 5-year look ahead, which is really sort of building on this design-led approach with our kind of new methods. So if you go onto our blog, there's loads of amazing 11 cards that we have that are all in bright colours that kind of express lines of inquiry that we want to follow. Mm-hmm. And they've got things in there like theatre, art, games, super forecasting, body storming, all sorts of different avenues that we've kind of laid out as paths that we want to experiment in. And we have done over the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and we'll definitely link to all of these things as well in the show notes if anyone wants to check any of that out. All of this, to me, as someone who's, very interested in creativity and innovation and all of community, that kind of thing, I'm super signed up. I'm like, yeah, this sounds great. But I imagine that even with the kind of pitching model that you have within Policy Lab, where you're getting these kind of commissions from bodies, there must be people who are excited and enthusiastic about the work that you're doing. But I imagine that once you get in with a group and you start working with them, there might be people who come from a more traditional background of structuring things and hierarchies and so on and so forth, who are more resistant to the approaches that you have. And how do you convince people, or how do you get people on board with the fact that you're balancing these more innovative or creative approaches with still robust, thought through results at the end of the day that can be costed or implemented or actually realized?
Right. Well, I mean, we take a design-led approach fundamentally, and that means tailoring what we do to our commissioners. So our commissioners will have different requirements and different risk appetites as well, right? So for some commissioners, we may work with them because it might be good for us to make new inroads into a new department, for example, because we don't always have great links with all departments, kind of thing. Other ones, we might work with them because they've got an interesting problem, and other ones because they give us an opportunity to do some of our strategic, really creative out there stuff, right? So there is a real mix of stuff that happens, and it really is, and ultimately a design-led approach, when you compare it to slightly more traditional policy-making methods, gives better policy because you're getting a lot of people work there. You're kind of getting a lot more buy-in. It gets tested a lot more before going to the pilot stage. So you're having a lot more kind of experts' eyes on things and assessing them. And you can use creative methods to do that. And a lot of them are kind of self-evident in terms of their value and things, when you describe them. And as well, we have a real sort of big toolbox of stuff that we draw on. So yeah, it's that tailoring approach kind of thing. So you pick out which tools you think might be appropriate. And it's always nice to sort of push the boundaries slightly with commissioners to see where their limits are, what is the edge of acceptable kind of thing. But by and large, generally people are quite interested and trust our expertise. So I think we've got a reasonably good reputation in government. So we can sort of lean on that a bit as well. So yeah, there's a few different things. It's tailored. It does give better results generally. And I think we have reasonable confidence within the team that we're going to do a good thing. So yeah, I guess something around that.
Yeah. I'm wondering if maybe it would help people also to just have some examples of this, of some of the work that you've done. And perhaps with, if you could give an example perhaps of some organisation or body that you've worked with where you've gone in with one set of expectations, or they've come to you with one problem and you've ended up in quite a different place, unexpected from how they originally came. Because I think that's one of the things that, as I understand, this process, it's better than traditional models at getting you to the actual problem that you have, like you were saying, a more refined version of that problem. But it also, a lot of the time, there's not necessarily a shared understanding of what the problem even is in the first place. So I'm just wondering if you have any examples like that of where people have come to you with, we'd like help with this thing and we'd like to do it kind of in these ways, and then the end result has ended up being an unexpected or different solution from the original premise.
So one example that we kind of that I can give is so there's a lot that I can't talk about, unfortunately, but one example that I can talk about is the National Parks project that we worked on, where there was a question about diversity in attendance at national parks. The typical people that tended to be sort of like the weekend ramblers, and not a very diverse picture really. So there was an investigation where we went out with our ethnographers and we interviewed people, spoke to people in different communities around why they didn't go to national parks and what were the barriers and things like that. And then this picture started to form. There were lots of different reasons, certainly ones around access, so certainly with people who have physical access issues, there were some problems there. But then the ones around cultural issues as well. So the idea that certain minorities might view national parks, for example, as being quite scary places. Like the forest is kind of like a place you don't go to, I think was the quote that I gave, kind of thing. Normally they would go around to their friends and neighbours and things and share food and things like that. But then the wildlife and nature was actually something quite scary. So then part of that led to this approach where we spoke to people who were champions in those particular groups. They would go away and help people, basically accompany them into the national parks and help people in that respect. So in that case, it was kind of an unearthing, but sort of a learning experience for I think it was Natural England who did that one, I'm not quite sure. But it was a learning experience for them to actually go away and then to understand that this was an issue. And then they needed to perhaps change some of their messaging and some of the ways that they approach things to actually encourage. It wasn't just a case of not having access to a car or some of the more obvious things. It was actually, there were some cultural elements to this. Mm-hmm. And so that leads to outcomes that's kind of like was led by the research, basically.
So they were accompanying physically people into the forest?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't work on the project. I know about it because it's one of the examples that we give in our training, basically. But
right.
Yes, from what I understand, there are voluntary groups who would accompany the people, take them on bus tours, things like that. They would go in large groups, so there was like a safety in numbers element to it, and then show them around kind of thing, and bring the social element to natural parks. It wasn't like go off on your own type thing. Mm-hmm. It was like a group activity kind of thing, which kind of more closely aligned with typical social experiences.
Sounds really lovely. I mean, you're working with all of these different groups. I imagine, I don't know what your numbers are, but like the individuals that you must have worked with over the period of time the Policy Lab has existed must be well into the thousands and more.
Yeah, so Policy Lab has been around for 10 years now, and so we've been going, and so we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary, so there should be some interesting things like celebrations and things like that. We have worked with, I think it's like 250 different projects we've worked on. Wow. It's about 40 a year at the moment, so the numbers have increased. Mm-hmm. The projects tend to be somewhere between 3 months and 9 months, and we do shorter engagements as well, like very, very short compact sprints, which might be sort of a day long. And then we also do this training as well, sort of very short 90-minute sessions to other people in the civil service and people that are coming through the training program. Civil service has an amazing kind of training program called the Fast Stream, which really accelerates people through their career in the civil service. So you get very young people working in really quite interesting roles from the start, and we're kind of plugged into that, which is really good.
And from working with all of these different people, all of these different groups over the last 10 years, and what have you, either as an individual or our Policy Lab as an organisation, what have you learned about fostering genuine collaboration between policymakers and the public, and how has that developed from the kind of origins of the organisation to the way that you work now? Has it remained fairly consistent, the approach that you take, or are you implementing new techniques and new ideas on a broader scale based on the work that you've been doing and the learning that you're taking away from it?
Yeah, so the organisation started out as a design-led organisation, but they also, at the time, digital or data was kind of like one of the things they were looking at. Now that's kind of landed now in government, so that's really moved on. And so is Policy Lab as well. We're very much focusing now on the design and then also new methods and things like that. So we've brought in lots of new methods. We've engaged with lots of different stakeholders. So I would say the majority of our work is looking at experts who are internal and external. So that would include sort of academics, industry stakeholders, NGOs, so that's non-government organisations, charities, and community groups. So one of the tricky things is actually finding people, because as a central government, you want to reach a good variety of people. And so it can be easier to work through organisations, but we make some real effort to snowball from that and then to actually get down and speak to individuals and citizens and people affected. So I worked on a project that was very interesting. It was about looking at people who had drug and alcohol rehabilitation requirements. So rather than being sentenced to jail time for a drug or alcohol related offence, they would be given sort of a treatment requirement where they go into a care. They'll be asked to attend a clinic for a program of rehabilitation, and we wanted to understand a bit more about that. So we snowballed from organisations who sort of provided these care, which generally tends to be charities and volunteer organisations, and from that we were able to talk to the people who are actually undergoing this program. Last year, that was a really interesting experience, for me, especially coming from doing a lot of programming where you're very locked away, not really talking to anyone, to suddenly speaking to members of society that's sort of like a very different from people that I would normally have talked to in my previous roles. We did some work with farmers, so like going around into the countryside, so all around the country, and that's Britain right the way up into Scotland and into Wales as well. We spoke to farmers, what their plans are for their land, basically, really getting to understand some of the kind of pressures that farmers face. And that was a really interesting experience. A lot of travelling, but very, very, very rewarding. You find out a lot, basically, just from talking to people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the huge benefits of an organisation like Policy Lab, is just the flow of communication. We as citizens often experience the world, we experience government and policy as something that is applied to us. And we get a say in how that is shaped through moments of democracy, like voting in a general or a local election or a referendum or something like that. We might sign a petition or we might attend a protest. But in general, I think most people experience policy as this kind of top-down approach that it impacts their life, but they don't necessarily have impact on. But this ability to feed information in the other direction seems to be, to me, one of the main benefits of having an organisation like Policy Lab. And then to add to that as well, being able to throw in creative and innovative solutions to some of the difficulties that people experience. That seems to just be, the icing on the cake kind of thing. And do you feel like there is an appetite for, when you're talking about going out and speaking to people who are experiencing addiction, or to farmers, or members of society who aren't sitting in suits in Parliament or in a local council or wherever, potentially. Do you feel like there's growing appetite or interest from people further up the chain of command to hear those stories and to incorporate the experiences of people into the way that they shape policy? Or is that something that you're kind of trying to sell to them through the methods at Policy Lab?
I think people further up the chain are very interested in sort of making good policy and having successful policy, and involving people in the process and getting that feedback leads to that and is a route to that. I can't talk about sort of like the political appetite, but I think there are some kind of weak signals that participation is sort of more encouraged. So it feels like there is an appetite for this. You just hear this from the conversations that are happening in the kind of general sort of political dialogue. If you listen to like things like Resist Politics and all this kind of thing, right? They often talk about things like citizen assemblies and things like that, right? So these kind of things are being talked about just generally. And so far, my sense is that hasn't been ruled out by any means. So that's kind of what I mean by the weak signals. There seems to be some kind of sense of this, that this is the direction that things are going. We incorporate a lot of co-design in our work. So I think what I described earlier perhaps might sound slightly extractive, going to people and just talking to them kind of thing, But actually we do workshops where we actually do consult and involve people at many stages. So they might come back again and then be involved in that kind of double diamond process, as we go back and forth. And we're actually even seeing that some policymaking is being sort of pushed out into the public. So a recent project I worked on is trying to tackle really local issues by providing sort of resource, funding and expertise from government bodies to public to actually come up with their own policies around, in this case, natural sites, protected sites around the country. So that way, the policy making can be sort of kept local, where the people understand the issues and the real pressures. And frankly, where it's just not possible to administer from a central location. It's through this kind of partnering approach that when you have like place-based policy is almost necessary. So yeah, I think there is more of this kind of thing happening, and I would like to think that it's we're helping with that. So it feels like we're going in the right direction.
And in terms of your specific work, I mean, you're kind of marrying this background that you have with the programming and, you know, the technology aspect of the Creative Technologist. But from what I can see with the blog, with the way that you present the work that you've been doing, the way that you are actually working directly with people as well, my interpretation is that storytelling and crafting narratives is quite integral to the way that Policy Lab and your work is created. What is the importance of that in the, you know, to you, the kind of work that you do, the idea of story and narrative? You're working with ethnographers and video work as well. I was wondering if you could speak on that for a little bit.
Well, so you're good to pick up on the ethnography side of things. So the story and narrative there really tells something quite compelling. I think pure ethnographers try not to put too much narrative in there, kind of thing. But they are put together as short set pieces, because one of the sort of constraints that we have is quite often we have to communicate things in a very short amount of time. So we put together these sort of 2-minute videos, because generally when you're kind of dealing with decision makers, they're very busy. They've got 100 decisions to do that day or whatever it is. And basically you don't get a lot of time. And there are definitely sort of lines of inquiry in those cards that we put forward that really lean into storytelling. And so, you know, art in policy, there's lots of narrative that comes in through art. And actually art can be a really effective way, and arts-based methods can be a really effective way to compel people to action. And that often comes through storytelling, through ritual and folklore sometimes. You know, it's this kind of thing that, you know, you can build community through arts-based practices and arts-based methods that really leads to, that positive action that you might be trying to affect. Whereas, you know, perhaps a more qualitative or quantitative approach, you can understand the problem to some degree, but you might not be sort of compelled to do anything about it. You know, it might be thinking, okay, I understand that cerebrally, but I don't feel it, kind of thing. And I think as well, you know, things like moral imaginings as well. So we work with a practitioner called Phoebe Tickell who does moral imaginings.
What can you explain what that is?
So it's taking a few different lenses on a problem. So one of them is, I'm going to have to get this right, but more than human is one of them. So there's like the more than human lens. So, you know, what would different stakeholders, such as plants or animals, or it could even be something like a bit of geography, like a river or the soil or pollen or something like that, right? And you kind of take those perspectives and explore a problem through that. Now, to be clear, this is to stress test problems, and this happens generally in the kind of going big with ideas stage kind of thing, you know. Right. So this is something that was really quite useful to get those perspectives in that might get missed otherwise. That you know, rather than sort of reading an ecologist paper, you know, you can actually tell stories about these things, and then you can then really bring that to life. And then it also applies a lens which is about ancestors and future generations, so the kind of a time-based lens as well. This is really sort of thinking about, you know, what would our ancestors think about this? What are the people, you know, what are our descendants going to think about this, essentially? And there may be another lens, but yeah, essentially it's applying these different lenses to things, sort of slightly critical thinking, I suppose, and sort of it helps stress test these policies in ways that might not happen if you're sort of dealing with a stack of academic research, let's say, something like that.
It's a wonderful way to approach things, and it reminds me of I don't know if you heard about the situation that we had in Iceland recently, where we had our presidential elections, and someone legally changed their name to the name of a glacier here and ran as the glacier for president.
Okay.
And it's part of this kind of like global movement that's happening where different groups around the world are trying to give personhood status to different geological landmarks is not quite the right word, but significant places that are under threat because of climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the things as well, like this was spearheaded here, this effort was spearheaded by a group of artists.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of the ways in which artists can think about the way that they can use their creative powers, their imagination, to influence governmental policy decisions by presenting a different perspective or a different point of view. And I suppose, Policy Lab is really unique as a structure within the British governmental system. I don't know, I'm sure you do, about other governments that have a similar or equivalent structure or hierarchy. But for artists or creative people more generally, what takeaways do you think or encouragement do you think you can give to people for how they might want to think about their practice as influencing policy or influencing public decision making? How can people engage more effectively in that space?
Okay. Just to jump back slightly, my MP when I was growing up, Austin Mitchell, was the MP for Grimsby, and he changed his name to Austin Cod Mitchell.
Wow.
to highlight the plight of the fishing industry in the town. I thought that's quite a relevant sort of context for Iceland here, kind of thing. Yeah. So, it's
not new then, people have been doing this.
Yeah. He was quite a character actually. He used to sort of quote Thunderbirds and things in Hansard and stuff like that. So it's like, but yeah, creatives and sort of working with policy. I mean, I know government can sort of seem like a closed door, but that there are lots of problems that need solving in government, and I'm very, very confident that arts-based approaches have value to give, kind of thing. In that context. So one example, is that when you have a kind of a new policy area to explore, it's very, very it's a complete blank canvas. There's lots of possibilities there. And you can take a very sort of methodical approach to that and then sort of only sort of really scratch the surface. But an arts-based approach, you can really follow where the energy is and not necessarily have to sort of justify every step, but sort of like jump around, use your artistic license to actually sort of like find those bits of interest and those areas that are kind of really interesting until you find, the thing that actually could be the kind of cut-through issue, So I think there's definitely sort of elements there as to sort of in terms of research, when you're starting with a blank canvas, an artistic approach is amazing. There's definitely elements of if a movement is sort of created around what you're doing. I'm not sort of suggesting you rabble-rouse or anything like that, but basically when enough people get interested in an issue, then, policymakers will take note. And provided this is done in a constructive and, open-minded way where where the artists are willing to sort of speak to the policymakers, and it's not just a throw stones type thing, then that can lead to some really constructive kind of dialogues and sort of really interesting work. And then I think generally speaking, I mean, certainly in the UK context, people are willing to listen. You just have to bear in mind that there's often lots and lots of other factors they have to bring in. So policymakers are, they have to really sort of spin or really square a lot of circles, right? And that includes sort of resolving lots of tensions between lots of different sort of pressures and things. So it's sort of, if you come at it with that mindset, I feel that's a good way to begin, not be too sort of bolshy and have that kind of constructive, collaborative, open mindset. And I think that's a really good start. And I've seen some amazing work which has used this kind of approach kind of thing to do some just incredible stuff. I mean, I don't know if I won't go into it, but if you have a chance to check out Ruth Levine's Sheffield wheat experiment, it's just an amazing.
Maybe you can give us a little overview of that, because you were talking about this. You gave a really wonderful talk yesterday in Hapner House, where we're based. East of Moon is based, and it's this wonderful creative community in Reykjavik. And you talked about this I wanted to call it experiment. I suppose it was, but this practice, and it was so interesting. Maybe you can give a little overview of that, because I also think that there's so many things that Policy Lab does, and you're working on such a vast number of projects every year. And of course, I encourage people to go to the website and check out more of what you're doing. But maybe for those who are just going to be sort of like skimming the surface of this, to give them more of a flavour of some of the things, this project sounded really special. So yeah.
Yeah, so this project, I mean, to be clear, this wasn't a Policy Lab project. This was Ruth's own work.
Right.
But we are working with Ruth at the moment. She's been brought in our manifest programme to understand how artists might sort of work when they're embedded in policy. And actually,
right. Okay.
So actually, her and two other groups of artists have just finished their work, and they've done an exhibition in London. I think it was last week. So I was over there last week. And we saw kind of what they had to present back. Some really amazing stuff, really, really interesting, again, arts-based approaches in a policy context, really pushing. I mean, it was amazing sort of seeing them and talk to the policymakers as well. I mean, some of them were really open to it. Some of them were clearly being quite challenged by it, you know. So it was, but the work, from my mind, was quite obviously had some real value to it, in terms of how it sort of dug into the issues and some of the problems and played those back. Presented them, but yeah, this work that Ruth did was, I mean, it was supported by some government funding, so perhaps we can sort of claim something from that. But basically, it's called the Sheffield wheat experiment, and what they did is they took a strain of wheat which wasn't one of the allowed strains of wheat. So the DEFRA, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, there's kind of like an allowed list of wheat that they can grow out. Now, I might not have all the details of this correct, so please bear with me. Absolutely. But there is a set list of wheat, and it's difficult to grow wheat outside of that, other than for a set number of reasons, kind of thing. And I think there's probably some good reasons why this is the case, but she was just quite keen on experimenting with that a bit. So she took this kind of like strain of wheat. She distributed it to 200 growers around Sheffield, and they all took it away, grew it on their plot of land, and then recombined it again at the end of the year for next year's crop. Mm-hmm. And they kind of grew this crop together, and it formed a new strain of wheat that belonged to the community of Sheffield. So Sheffield has its own wheat now.
Which is just such a cool sentence. I'm just really into oddities like that, I suppose.
Yes. And to be clear, they let DEFRA know about this. And DEFRA gave them permission to do this for a set time period. And so now Sheffield has its own strain of wheat, and they've been doing this for 5 years now. So they've been going away and sort of planting it in different areas, coming back. And they've started to use this as a platform to sort of explore the wider economy kind of thing. And so they're kind of making flour with the wheat. We've re-established rituals around harvest and some of the kind of folk traditions around harvest and things like that. An interesting thing actually was during COVID, when the supermarket shelves were empty of flour, they had tons of the stuff because basically they'd grown their own wheat. So it speaks to resilience, and food sovereignty and things like that. And it was, and they're really using this as a way to sort of examine our relationship to food and also the food systems that surround it. She was quite clear that she didn't want to just sell this wheat to local bakers. She actually wanted to think about what the current, as a way to sort of understand and perhaps shape the current system in different ways. It was really interesting, the kind of approach that she was taking. I should say it was a community thing. Mm-hmm. So, but she led it, kind of thing. So yeah, I thought it was a great bit of work.
It sounds super fantastic, and I'm really excited that she's now working directly with you in Policy Lab, and I'm sure that they'll result in even more interesting things to follow as well. I want to finish by picking up on something that you said at the presentation that you gave yesterday that immediately struck me, and it was very simple, but you said a good policy delivered is far better than a perfect policy just on paper. And I wonder, to me, sounds like a strong ethos in what you're doing. How, in practice, how does that work?
I would say it's probably a bit too strong, actually, for a civil servant to say that. But I think it kind of does ring true in my experience. I'm talking from personal experience here. So essentially, policymaking is, there's definitely it's an art as much as it is a science. We always strive to be evidence-led. We always strive to sort of work from solid scientific principles where available. But then the nature of policymaking is, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of squaring of circles and sort of reconciling of lots of different pressures. And those pressures sort of come from all over. We have kind of most obviously we have the political strata. It's sort of like they sort of give our direction, and they have a set of things they want to achieve, and it's up to us to deliver that. And so we're kind of left. So how is kind of like the question we ask quite often. But then also you have to sort of square that with the academia and the current science. We want to be evidence-led. We want to be experts, industry, citizens, just in general, but then also affected citizens, frontline staff who actually have to deliver the thing. There's lots of other sort of inputs into this. I said they were actually bringing more than human into it and stuff like this, right? So there are lots of these kind of like things that go into the maelstrom of policy that has to swirl around, and eventually policy happens. So that approach, there's not a recipe for that. It's not a single recipe to sort of do all these trade-offs and things. And so generally what we do is we have to navigate it. And that navigating really maps much more to an arts-based approach. You have discussions with people, you find out, there's a bit of wiggle room there. Basically, that's actually an avenue we can explore. And then you can see if that actually leads through to some workable solution. Now, ideally, you can present some options back to the sort of political strata at the end of the day, but usually to get there is very much this kind of process of essentially what is an arts-based process, to be honest. So, and in taking a very open approach, you're bringing people along, and that usually helps with the kind of delivery of it as well. Because, if anyone is sort of blindsided by this, it's normally a lot easier to torpedo something than it is to sort of build something and get something through, right? So you kind of want to bring people along, which is again why we sort of advocate for these open policy approaches, and it just helps with that kind of deliveries. So now, from a technically, it might not be the perfect solution, and you might spend more time in that process of sort of figuring out what is the perfect thing, but at the end of the day, you've got to deliver it, right? And government tends to be quite fast paced as well, so.
Yeah, and there's also this idea of perfect. I mean, perfect for whom? Because like you say, you have all of these different stakeholders. You've all of these different participants in this process, with different ways of relating to how this will be experienced. So what's perfect to one person is not going to be perfect to everybody, and I think that marrying those experiences and communicating those compromises is what gets you somewhere. I really don't envy you that being in that position sometimes of having to, think about all of these different needs and desires within that process. That sounds like a lot to kind of bring on board, but it's probably quite exciting also.
It is. I think some people really, really sort of lean into that sort of systems thinking and quite enjoy the challenge. And it's not just on you, you're kind of working in a team and you're working with the people, and they often suggest the solutions. And you're like, actually, that's pretty good. So from those conversations and things, that's where a lot of this can come from. But yeah, communicating back those challenges and things, is super important, because there's nothing more frustrating than sort of engaging in a process and then, and being quite clear about what you want, and then that not happening and you not knowing why, right? Imagine any job interview where you didn't quite make it, and or whatever, right? And then they don't give any feedback, right? And that kind of thing happens exactly with sort of like when we engage with people, we are quite sort of mindful that it's important to give some follow up and to sort of, to let them know how things went and why, right? Because otherwise people can get really frustrated. It can really lead to more distrust, there's sort of like, I think it's agreed that level of trust in government isn't great, but being more open and transparent can help with that. And you might be exposed to some of the to some frustrations, and you might think that actually some of these things aren't, it's not how you would have done it, but at least and then you're kind of like, and your voice was heard, and that you were considered, and actually you had a part in it. You were able to actually feed back and make suggestions and sort of present your own solutions. So that approach, we totally advocate for that. And
in terms of what's coming up for you next, is there anything on the horizon that you're particularly excited to work with this year with Policy Lab? You were talking about this manifest. What is it called?
The Manifest Project. So the Manifest Project is ongoing, and so that is. I think this year's sort of cohort is coming to a close now. I'm not sure what the future for that holds. Fingers crossed it will continue. The future, from my perspective, is a lot of the stuff that we do in Policy Lab is very analog and very sort of face to face. And part of our thing is, how do we get these methods used across government? Sort of not just in a bubble. We do our best with training, we do our best with working with people, commissioners, all this kind of thing. But government's used like 500,000 people, and we really want to get these methods out there. So from my perspective, I'm working with some people here in Iceland around sort of getting some platforms, online that we can actually increase sort of access geographically, as well as for people who can't engage, at a workshop at a set time, so asynchronous kind of engagement, so when they might be sat on the bus or whatever, and they can sort of perhaps take part then. And I'd also as well, just to sort of remove some other barriers, especially, with costs and things like that. I know this is quite sort of hard-nosed stuff, but, value for money is really important. So we, so I'm doing some work on that, which is why I'm here in Iceland. And also obviously to meet the people here and wrap the house kind of thing. It's really curious to see what's going on here. It seems like a very exciting place. So that I think that's kind of on the horizon. And then no doubt, and I've just finished this piece with Natural England, which is this one where we're trying to get early stage creatives doing sort of local policy around protected sites. Follow on from now, I don't know. It depends on just what comes up, basically. Right now, I'm just sort of focusing on the Iceland stuff.
That's brilliant, and it was so great to have you here. And I think it's I've seen it already sparking a lot of really interesting conversations based off of your talk and just your availability in Hafner House for the creative minds here. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast, and we'll put all of the links to your work in the show notes. And enjoy the rest of your time in the country.
Thank you.